The sixth and final step to develop a well-managed and disciplined class is to decrease unacceptable behavior with discipline on page 120. Corrective feedback and the use of consequences can be effective in decreasing unacceptable behavior. You have to reinforce consequences. They are minor consequences, but the student may think it's major, but they are minor consequences for this age of their life, but they have to learn there are consequences. And you as a teacher need to teach them that there are actions that are going to follow their misbehavior. So, using corrective feedback. Almost everything here you need to know because it is so important for you as a teacher. How can we use corrective feedback? We've already tried using positive reinforcement to increase acceptable behavior and trying to use that to replace unacceptable behavior. But if they're not responding to that, what are you going to do? You're going to use the effective rule of thumb that they talk about on page 121 that I want you to know. An effective rule of thumb before using corrective feedback is to reinforce the acceptable or desired behavior twice. So, for example, assume a child is slow to stop on signal, while most of the others are stopping and listening properly. Ask the class to move and freeze again. Reinforce those students who did right, who did what they were supposed to do. Reinforcing the class rather than individuals with older students. But if the result is unacceptable, try it again. If the primary grade classes misbehaving students frequently emulate those who are being reinforced. If not, you might have to use some corrective feedback. So I want you to know your corrective feedback should be clear and specific. They should know exactly what behavior they are to stop and what the acceptable behavior they are to start. So I want you to know you should use corrective feedback as soon as the misbehavior has, as soon after the misbehavior has occurred. So as soon as possible. You want to deliver positive reinforcement immediately following the acceptable behavior. So, whether delivering corrective feedback or consequences, here's some steps to avoid teacher-student conflicts. All 8 of these steps I want you to know. You don't want to embarrass the students and yourself. So number 1, do not address the student publicly. Give the class a task to do, maybe jog or something while you talk to the student, but you do not want to bring out this situation in front of the class. And that's the exact same thing, too, in the classroom. Number 2, I want you to know you should isolate the student and yourself. Do not correct a student where others can hear what you are saying. The third suggestion, deal with one student at a time. If there are several students misbehaving together, that can be common. Separate them, deal with their unacceptable behavior one-on-one. You know how they say power in numbers? Separate them. The fourth one, state your position once. Repeat it once. If you believe the student did not understand, do not argue or try to prove your point. That is not the place to do it. Take no more than 10 or 15 seconds to tell the student the unacceptable behavior and state what is the acceptable behavior. And tell them, this is their warning. So, stating your position. Deliver it and move away. Avoid the glaring eyeball-to-eyeball look when delivering your corrective feedback. This will give yourself back. You'll be able to get back on track in a positive manner. reinforcing one or two students. Move away, but don't expect possible immediate compliance. Walk away after you delivered your feedback. Do not threaten or bully the student. It builds resentment and may cause greater problems in the future. Number 7, avoid touching the student when you are correcting them. Sometimes this sends a mixed signal, a mixed message to the student. Number 8, do not be sarcastic or raise your voice excessively. Clearly state your acceptable behavior you expect the students to exhibit, but make sure you do not curse or raise your voice. To decrease unacceptable behavior, you might also have to use reprimands. They are commonly used to decrease unacceptable behavior if done in a caring and constructive way. They can be effective. So, identify the unacceptable behavior, state briefly why it's unacceptable, communicate that to the students what behavior is desired, and they give the example. You were talking while I was speaking. It is unacceptable behavior and bothers me and other students, so please listen when others are speaking. That was a nice way to get the message across. Do not reprimand in front of other students. It embarrasses the students. It can diminish their self-esteem. They can feel belittled. They might lash out and behave even more unacceptable. Speak about the unacceptable behavior, not the person, when reprimanding. Ask that the behavior stop rather than telling a student that you are always causing problems in this class. Avoid those generalized statements, negative statements. After you reprimand and ask for the acceptable behavior, reinforce it when it does occur. You need to be very vigilant in looking for the acceptable behavior, since reinforcing that behavior will cause it to occur more often in the future. You can also remove positive consequences from the student when the misbehavior occurs. Free time, not allowed to participate. There's only some points that you need to realize as a person. This isn't on the test, but boy, you need to understand this as a teacher and as a parent. Number 1, make sure the magnitude of the removal fits the crime. Recess for a week is pretty extensive to remove something like that, so it would have to be a very serious offense for a removal of recess for a week. 2 minutes, 5 minutes in timeout. You know, if they come back to the class and play and they do it again, then they might need to be in timeout longer. But make sure you don't forget about them. I had that happen to me years ago. I forgot about the students, and they were perfectly happy just sitting up in the bleachers. Be consistent is a big problem you're going to have as a teacher. Every teacher has that problem. Be consistent in your removal and treating of all students and occurrences. You cannot show favoritism. Make sure the students understand the consequences of their misbehavior before receiving the penalties. Chart a student's misbehavior to see if the frequency is decreasing. You may have to notice, is it doing any good? Is the reprimands doing any good? A third way to decrease unacceptable behavior is to use timeout. I want you to know teachers find timeout effective for dealing with unacceptable behavior that occurs randomly on an individual basis. So I want you to know, when placing your students in timeout, tell children they are valued as individuals, but it's the misbehavior that's unacceptable. It's so important that they understand it's the misbehavior that they are choosing to do. You do not allow any other student in your class to behave that way, and you're not expecting anything different from them. I also want you to know that you need to discuss your timeout plan with the students so they know exactly what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, as well as the consequences of misbehavior. So posting a list of acceptable behavior or rules and the consequences for unacceptable behavior might be a very good idea. And another thing you need to know about timeout is make sure that when you're using timeout, that's not a, they might want to be in timeout, and so they're perfectly content. You got to be careful with that. Whenever you're using timeout, if they like being in timeout, well, then they're going to be perfectly content over there. So when the first misbehavior occurs, you're going to warn the student quietly. Second misbehavior occurs, you're going to put them in a pre-designated timeout spot. It could be timeout for 5 minutes, or you can return when I say you can return. The problem is you may forget them, like I talked about earlier. And then the chronic offender may stay in timeout longer for the same offense as others. So you got to analyze your situation. If there's a third misbehavior, the student should go to timeout for the remainder of the period. If the misbehavior continues, you might have to consider an in-school suspension. If the consequence is still ineffective, the next alternative would be to call the parents in for a conference with you and the principal. It all depends, school's a privilege, and they need to understand that whenever they are in school. Here is an example of putting a student in timeout and what you're expecting of them. Because if you want it to be this serious, then you post exactly where you want them to be in timeout and what do you expect of them. This is what I was referring to earlier about timeout for the students, the consequences for unacceptable behavior, for the first misbehavior, second misbehavior, third misbehavior, and then I went on to talk about the fourth misbehavior where you might have to do a parent-teacher conference. To continue with decreasing unacceptable behavior, with the older students, you might have to actually implement a behavior contract. And what is a behavior contract that I want you to know? A written statement specifying certain student behaviors that must occur for students to earn certain rewards or privileges. The contract is drawn up after a private conference to decide on appropriate behaviors and rewards. It's agreed upon, signed by the student and the teacher. It allows the student to make decisions that will improve his or her own behavior. So I want you to know this behavior contract may be a successful strategy for the intermediate grade students with severe behavior problems. Every attempt should be made to find activities in the PE classroom that are naturally rewarding. But if this is not possible, I want you to know different types of rewards may have to be used. For instance, what if the student likes music? You could allow him or her to spend some time selecting music to be used in the class during the next week. As the behavior improves and the student's attitude becomes more positive, your rewards could be switched to PE activities. So the whole objective, though, I want you to know, is that the contract is gradually phased out. But these are for your very severe cases with your intermediate grade levels. You might also have to incorporate behavior games for overall class behavior. Behavior games for overall class behavior. And that's what I want you to know. Behavior games are an effective strategy for changing the class's behavior in the areas of management, motivation, and discipline. So you may have to use games to change the whole class behavior. And they give you an example on page 124 of a behavior game where you could divide the class into 4 to 6 squads. Each squad has a designated color to identify each squad. And then here's the rules. Each squad member must be ready for activity and in proper position at a designated starting time. If this happens, they get 2 points. Each squad member must move from one activity to another activity within the specified time, if you say 10 seconds, 20 seconds, or 30 seconds, and begin the appropriate behavior. If each squad member does that, 1 point for each activity. Each point earned is rewarded with 1 minute of free activity time on Friday. Free activity time includes what basketball, frisbee, whatever they want to do, whatever's popular. The squad with the most points for the week earns a bonus of 5 points. So you're going to explain the allotted time for each management episode and give a go signal and a stop signal and award the points for appropriate behavior. It might be easier just to write down the ones who didn't do it. Hopefully there's fewer ones you have to keep track of. Number 4, successful squads are praised and their points recorded on a small card. Unsuccessful squads are not hassled or criticized, just reminded that they need to earn a point, that they did not earn a point. Then on Fridays, you award the appropriate squads. It's a lot of paperwork, but you're about to pull your hair out because you can't take it anymore and you have to do something. So this is an effective behavior game, the way you can do it. So I want you to know, on page 125, they say when designing your behavior games, be sure to structure them so that any student or any squad is able to win the game. Any student or any squad is able to win the game. You see here on page 125, they talk about another effective behavior game can be used to help students persist at learning activities in a station type of approach. And then a possible solution, divide the class into 4 to 6 squads like we talked about earlier. Set up the learning stations with the activities to be practiced. Make a recording of music. Inform them that if everyone in their squad is practicing the appropriate tasks, the squad will earn a point. Exchange points for minutes of time. And I want you to know you need to change the music regularly. Change and slowly increasing the intervals between gaps until the gaps are eliminated. I want you to know the music then serves as a discriminative cue for future practice time. This is an example of an individual behavior contract for one particular student, and you would list the rules, whatever it is this particular student is having trouble with, and then you fill it all in. This is an example of a group behavior contract, and you list the rules that you want them to follow. That may be different. It might only be 1 or 2 rules. Hopefully it's not more than 3. And then you state here how the point system is earned. And the squad members sign it. Lastly, you should use criticism sparingly. I want you to know criticism and punishment used should be used with caution and good judgment. Sometimes criticism is used with the belief that it will improve student performance, but some teachers make scolding and criticism the behavior control tools because these tools give the impression that the results are effective and immediate and that the misbehavior is going to stop. But that's not always the case. The criticism, punishment may lead to a negative type of environment. The old saying, "It hurts me more than you," often applies. Most teachers feel uncomfortable when they must criticize or punish students. So The negative aspect of criticism is that it does not offer a solution. So, let's make punishment a last resort. As I said earlier, you need to make sure the punishment fits the crime. That's what's going to be a difficult possibility for you on what to do. The making sure, how serious of a crime. You definitely want to give a warning signal to the students first. You do not want to threaten the students, because whatever you say you're going to punish them with, you got to make sure you follow through with it, or they're going to feel like it's just hot air and they don't have to listen to you. The punishment should always follow the misbehavior immediately. What you need to be concerned about, okay, and then there's one more on page 126. Punish quietly and calmly. That is so true. But in the paragraph before all of these points, what I want you to know is this, and this has happened to me as a parent, and it also happened to me as a teacher. When the children are punished, they learn to avoid the source of punishment. It forces them to be more covert in their action. They learn how to hide it better. I want you to know that. That is so true. And so that's another aspect or another reason why for avoiding punishment, the negative side effect that I was talking about earlier. So be careful and learn and ask other teachers for advice about punishment. Our last slide, expulsion. Hopefully you never have this situation occur, but don't be surprised. Unfortunately, it may. Serious problems should be discussed between the classroom teacher, the classroom teacher, and the principal. A group meeting may need to occur between the parents and the school personnel in order to discuss the situation. Expulsion can only be imposed after due process. Most of your school systems have established guidelines and procedures for dealing with disruptive students, and it has to be followed. So sending a child out of class means both the teacher and student have failed. So true. You, as a teacher, you are hired to handle, control, and discipline your class. You should not be sending students out of class to the principal's office unless for severe situations, such as fighting. All these other minor situations, that is your job. You are supposed to be handling those students and learning how to deal with those students. The end for Chapter 6.